Welcome everyone to our first webinar series. We'd like to start today with an introduction by Peter van den Ambly.
Welcome to the National Commissaire's webinar session, and thank you for sharing your passion for cycling. Commissaires play a very important role in our sport, whether this is at the national or the international level. The webinars are presented by experienced UCI international commissaires, and they will share their experiences with you, without any doubt an asset for your continuous development process. I would like to thank our international commissaires for sharing their knowledge and experience with you. Enjoy the 3 webinar sessions, and I wish you all the best in your further commissaires development.
So, hello. I hope that the connection is working well and everybody can hear us. Please write a message in case if there's any connection problem. So hello once again and welcome to the National Commissaire Webinar session for BMX Racing Specialization. My name is Andris Buivydas and I'm Commissaire's Coordinator, being responsible for the Commissaire's training at the UCI. I was in close contact with the continental confederations and national federations to implement registration procedure for these trainings. Therefore, by this time, you should have received all the relevant communication in preparation for the webinar sessions. It is worth mentioning that 80 national federations have submitted more than 1,200 applications for all the given trainings for the road, track, mountain bike, and BMX racing specializations, which is quite impressive, and it shows large interest in national commissary development. I can see that at this moment we already have 117 attendees who are following this session live. So that's really great. In case if you might have any technical issues to access these trainings, please feel free to contact me. So I'll try to help you. So just to give you a brief information, where does this training fit in Commissary Pathway? As it was announced, the webinar sessions have been designed specifically for mountain bike, track, and BMX racing specializations. Additionally, you will be also invited to complete several modules on e-learning training platform. The objective of these trainings is mainly to support existing national commissary training programs provided by your national federations. However, the current elite national commissaires also might find it useful in order to refresh their knowledge. For the road specialization, an extended training will be provided within e-learning platform. Due to completeness of those courses, there are no webinars planned for road specialization. Speaking about today's webinar, the presentation will be given by the UCI International Commissaire. I will introduce him shortly. Additionally, during the session, you will be invited to participate in the polls. There is no need to use your cameras or microphones during the session. However, please feel free to write your questions through GoToWebinar panel, and we will try to answer as many as possible by the end of the session. Each of 3 webinar sessions have been scheduled for 1 hour, giving 40 minutes for the presentation and the last part for your questions. The recorded versions of this webinar will be available to all the participants through the link provided in our previous communication. Additionally, these recordings will also appear as part of the training content within UCI e-learning platform. So Next slide. Yes, so before we start the session, I would like to introduce you with Jordi Ma, who will be the presenter for the entire session. So Jordi is an experienced mountain bike and BMX racing international commissaire, having officiated at multiple major international competitions. So we hope you will find this session interesting for your personal development. So now I wish to pass the word to Jordi.
Thank you, Andreas. I appreciate that. So today we have the first of our 3 webinars to go through, and today we're going to talk about control of BMX track activity. So as Andreas had mentioned, we had targeted these webinars to officials that have some experience at a regional competition. They might have experience in various roles at those competitions and have some basic knowledge of those commissaire tools that are available. Now, we're preparing for, the idea would be help commissaire prepare for a national commissaire status, or maybe prepare national commissaires that are ready to go onto an elite national commissaire course. And I think for those of you that already have an international or ENC designation, I certainly hope some of this information helps you, refresh and remind yourself of the rules and regulations associated with BMXing. So to start off, I'd like to bring up a poll. So Andreas is going to present a poll for us. Or maybe I need to do that on my end. So what you should see is a question around how many years of experience as a commissaire do you have? Is it less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 15 years? We'll give you guys a few seconds to find your button and click on it and be able to provide us with a response. Great, if you could share those results, Andreas. It's fantastic to see that there are so many people joining us that are early in their career, that are looking for new information, and I certainly hope that today's session provides you that. Okay, if you can take down the poll there, Andreas. So yes, we're going to talk about control of the BMX track activity. And so there's 3 areas that we're going to look at as part of this conversation today. We're going to talk about the track layout itself and security of the track. We're going to talk about practice sessions. We're going to talk about one of the very first on-track activities associated with a BMX event. And lastly, we're going to discuss participant behavior at those early practice sessions and understand our role as commissaires in dealing with those. So the first place we're going to start is talking about the track layout. So what we want to cover here is making sure as a commissaire you understand your role in maintaining track and event security. We're going to look at some of the key areas around a track that are critical for maintaining control and identify, where are some of those control points that you might be able to control the traffic of both participants and of course spectators and others at the site. So in our role as commissaires, we're responsible for the safe execution of the sporting aspects of a BMX race. That means we're responsible to make sure the riders can participate safely, they can perform on the track, and are not influenced by outside interference. To do that means we need to make sure that the track is safely controlled. So as a commissaire panel, we need to be in control of the various components that maintain secure access to the racetrack. Now, this doesn't mean that we're manning security gates and security entry points, but we need to have direct connection with those that do and make sure that they have a clear understanding of their role and responsibility and our expectations of them. We have to also consider that we're not just worried about the athletes and where the athletes are going and where they come from, but we have to worry about spectators and parents and media and others and make sure that they too have clear access to the areas they need to get to and can do so safely. When we look at a very standard venue layout or track layout, you'll see here in this image, you've got a track in the middle. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a pits area where the riders warm up or do their repairs. You see there's stands to the top and to the bottom of the track. And some of the key things that you need to look at and understand are as follows. So we talk about a track perimeter fence. Sometimes this can be a very hard chain link fence. In other cases, it may be just some temporary flagging or tape, but it's important to clearly understand where the outside of the track is and have control over who comes and goes through those areas. We have team pits where the riders themselves would be waiting for their turn to practice or to race. We need to have a control point for those riders onto the track itself. So this allows that only the riders can proceed through staging in many cases onto the racetrack, and that we can prevent others from getting onto the track that don't belong there. We need to have an exit as well. We need to have a spot that the riders can, again, remove themselves from the track, retire to their warm-up area or to their pits area. We need to be able to make sure that people can't come back through that exit and gain access again to the track unknowingly to that of the commissaires. We need to make sure that that flow doesn't overlap so that you don't have riders trying to come on and riders trying to come off and potentially cause the conflict there. And lastly, of course, there'd be a public entrance, and we want to make sure that we control where the public has access, that they can get to the stands, but they also don't have access to get onto the track. We don't want an entrance that forces a spectator to come onto the property and walk across the finish line, as an example, to get to the track. So these are all things that we as commissaires need to understand and review when we get to the site. We need to be able to have these discussions with the race organizer and the track team to make sure that they're in place in a way that we can manage. Now, our understanding of the track or the venue expands beyond the physical track itself, where we as officials may spend much of our time. We need to look at a larger venue layout and understand where are the entrance points for spectators? Where do they walk from the entrance to their stands? Where do riders get dropped off and maybe have access to their pits? Where's the expo area? Is there any conflicts from the motion or movement of people from one area to another? And do we understand what those conflicts could be? In this photo here, you can see this is from the top of the start hill, but you can see there's a perimeter fence that runs along the side of the track, right in front of the grandstands. You can see that in the distance, there's some tents that are where the pits for the riders are, and you can see that they're in a fenced area where access is controlled and limited to them. You can see a special viewing area here right in the middle of the photo underneath the tent, which is where team managers had access. And again, only they have access, and it's not allowed from spectators or others. But it allows for those control and the enclosure of the appropriate areas. In some larger events, it becomes necessary to identify who can go into a particular control point through the use of credentials and markings. Some smaller events that many of you will be a participant in, you'll know the people that are to go in and out of key critical areas. But in larger events, when that number of people involved becomes larger, it becomes necessary to have a credential or ID tag that identifies who they are and what areas they have access to. And then at those control points, you can identify for a marshal or a security individual what color of badge or symbol or number is allowed through that control point to some place else onto the site. But it's also important to not think about just the officials or the people that are involved in the race and the riders, but the spectators as well. They can be obviously a large part of an event, and their interaction with the venue and how they get from place to place without interference of the race itself is important. In this photo, of course, you can see various control chains for people lining up for tickets or for lining up for concession. In the distance, at the very, very back of this photo, you can see a bridge that goes over top of a walkway. So this was to allow spectators to actually go up and over an entrance point from the riders onto the track. So it's important, again, as an official, that you think about not just, where are the riders going, what does the track look like, but take a step back and think about how spectators are going to move around that same facility. Moving on to practice sessions. So this is, again, one of the first on-track activities that we have during our racing. I want to talk about what we can do to prepare for practice. What is the minimum amount of practice that's required? What are the groups of practice? How are they made up? How do we decide what groups go together? What is how do we manage the practice itself through staging and on the track? And lastly, how do we effectively close one practice so that we can start the next practice on time? Practice is an essential part of the race weekend because it allows our riders to learn the track. It lets them understand how the gate is working, what the timing of the gate is for that particular track. Helps them understand the boundaries, where the lines are, where the racing paths are around the corners of the track, how they can choose their racing position either when they're on their own or when they're racing in a pack. Helps them understand the size and placement and speed necessary to clear the various obstacles. And importantly, also understand track conditions or changes in track conditions. Maybe that's a soft spot or an area that they want to avoid during racing. But also very critically, it provides practice for the commissaires and the medical personnel that are involved in the race. It helps us understand, the speed of the track, how quickly a rider can complete a lap, which is important for our timing of the event. It helps us know where critical areas are, where maybe crashes occur, and make sure that we're staged properly and positioned properly to deal with them. It helps us understand blind spots on the track and maybe where we need to have our commissaire stand so that we can better see the track during racing. Now for the riders, quite frequently the practice is the first thing they do and they rush out to get to practice. But for us as officials, there are a number of things that we need to make sure happen before practice itself even starts. First, we need to have riders go through confirmation or registration. We need to make sure that through the application of a number plate, we know that they have registered and they've completed the requirements to be involved in that race, that the license has been checked, that their registration fee's been paid, and that they're in good standing. We need to have a medical briefing with the medical team, make sure they understand our expectations of them, and make sure that we've provided for them the necessary access and egress and parking spots for ambulances and others. We need to work with gate operators, the staging officials, make sure they understand their role in a smooth execution of practice. And we have to speak with our track officials, if we have them, to be able to explain what we need them to do and what responsibilities the commissaires will be taking on themselves. Now, before each and every practice, whenever there's a significant gap, time delay between practices, the following things have to be done before we start. We need to complete a risk assessment, a track walk. We need to make sure that we have assessed the condition of the track surface, that it's still in good condition. We need to make sure the boundary lines are still clear, the paddings are in place, there's no rakes or brooms or rocks that are in the way, and those are all cleared away before we start each and every practice. So what are some of the things that we need to do to prepare for that practice? So we need to make sure staging is set up. It's not a good plan to start practice without having staging, fencing, and control points and staffing in place. It can make it very, very difficult to manage the riders coming onto the track. The boundary lines need to be painted. The riders are going to be practicing their race, and they need to be able to see where those lines are and where they should be going. We need to make sure all the hazards are removed, rocks, tools, hoses, Anything that could cause injury is made as safe as possible. Make sure padding or airbags, if they're being used, are installed and in the right position, the same position, so they don't move, again, for the riders between practice and racing. We need to make sure the medical teams and their equipment is in place. Have they found a spot that they can work from effectively? Do they have ready access to the track or the critical parts of the track? Do they have the equipment they need, and is it stowed safely? And then before anything can begin, we need to make sure that the track is got the right number of commissaires and officials, and they're all in position and ready to start. Ideally, all of those people are reporting to those positions at least 10 minutes before the practice itself starts, so that as a commissaire panel, we can make sure we can go through our checklist and our review before we actually get started. So I'd ask Andreas to bring up poll number 2. So according to our regulations, what is the minimum amount of practice that is required? Is that 30 minutes? Is it time to complete 4 laps with gates? Is it 60 minutes per day of training? Again, we'll give you guys a little bit of time to vote, and then we will share those results. Great, thanks, Andreas. Fantastic. As many of you identified, the correct answer is 4 laps with gates. So if you could bring down the poll, Andreas, that'd be great. I'm happy to see that even with our new group of commissaires, they're aware of these details of these regulations. So when we talk about sufficient time for 4 laps and gates, this means that the riders have enough time through one or many practices before racing starts to be able to do 4 laps with including the drop of a gate. Now, it doesn't say that they have to do those 4 laps. We as officials and organizers need to just make sure there was enough time that if they chose to, they could. If a rider doesn't show up to practice on time, chooses to leave practice because he has an issue with his bike or his equipment, chooses to not come back to do additional laps because they were busy or distracted, those don't mean that we need to give them additional time, as long as we have an understanding that they had time to do it if they wanted. It's important to look as officials for a few riders at the beginning of practice and time them to see when they come off the gate and when you might see them come back to the gate to assess whether there has been enough time given. You can see when they start and stop on 1 or 2 laps, and you can estimate, it takes 10 minutes to go from the gate through the course, through staging, and back to the gate again, as an example. And you can assess if you've got enough time allotted for that group to be able to do that. But it's important to understand that too much practice can be as challenging as too little. So, if you have a venue where it's very hot, very humid, or you have a practice that runs for a long time, riders can get tired. They can lose their judgment. They can decide that they want to try one more time on that big jump or that big feature and just go a little further. And that extends their risk of injury. And of course, it would be very unfortunate for a rider to get injured in practice before they could even race. Depending on the track, the surface could deteriorate or the weather. So it might mean that shortening practice protects the track to make sure that it's available and properly conditioned for racing. And lastly, as many of you that have worked races know, it can be exhausting for the officials and the support staff if they have to spend a large period of time out in the sun or in the cold rain or weather, and it can be draining on those officials and make it very hard for them to do their job. So it's important to get that right balance to allow the riders enough time, but make sure that we protect our staff and protect them from getting hurt. So practice itself is normally broken into individual groups. And we try to have some logic in how we apply those groups together in order to make sure that they can work well. Now, in very, very small races and very small club races, it might not be necessary with the number of riders that are there. But in larger races, national level events, you're going to need to make sure that you split people up. So the logical one that we normally divide is we place elite and junior men together. And the reason for that is in many tracks, there'll be a pro section or a more advanced jump feature section that is open only for the elite and junior men. So we can make sure that that's open for their practice and make sure they have access to it. But at the same time, we don't want others on the track at the same time as those gentlemen, because they're going to be going at a much faster rate of speed and they could easily crash with somebody that's not prepared for that. Additionally, we then normally have the elite and junior women practice together. One is to give them enough space and time to practice their lines. Typically, they're not doing those larger jump features and those larger sections, so we need to modify the access to the track or close those sections down. And it allows the elite and junior women the space they need to practice their craft. And then when we deal with challenge categories, we often put those together by age or ability. We obviously don't want young riders racing with adults. Again, there's a big speed difference and obviously weight difference that we don't want to see play out on the racetrack during practice. So we'll group those by a reasonable number of riders so that we can actually produce a reasonable practice. And maybe we'll have them split less than 12 to 16, 16 and over, or something like that. It's going to depend on the size of your race and the size of those groups. But grouping them together is important so that they have an opportunity to practice against those that are similar in ability and age. So when we have our commissaires ready to go out on the track, we need to position them in appropriate positions. So ideally for practice, we have 3 to 4 commissaires, and if that was the minimum we had, we need to place them in critical spots, as shown by the red stick figures that you can see now. So one of the most critical ones is somebody at the start hill or even in staging. This is controlling access to the track itself, making sure the right riders are coming onto the track, that we stop the riders, that we perform some of those assessments of, do they have the right equipment? Is their helmet done up? Are their gloves on? The next person that we'd like to see on the track is someone on the first corner. Often the first corner has the best view of the entire track. It's also, of course, where some of the crashes occur during practice, and they can see directly to the start hill and see the riders come through. The third commissary we like to have is somebody down between the first and third straight, or first and second straight, sorry. This is often, again, an area where there's crashes on these larger jump features, and sometimes it's hard to see those crashes when you're hidden from a corner vantage point. So having somebody down on the bottom of the straight where they can see the bottom of those jump features allows them to react quickly to any crash and protect riders. And if 4 was the only number we had available to us, we would push the 4th person probably out on the second corner, or even between the second and third straight, where they can get to the back half of the racetrack. During practice and during racing, the first half of the track is often where the higher speed, more dangerous crashes occur. It's infrequent that large high-speed crashes occur on the back half of the track. And so if we had to deploy our resources that we have, we would try to obviously protect the first part. Now, ideally, we have more. And so if we have additional marshals or additional track personnel, we would add to that complement. Obviously, staging is an area of focus that we would need to improve to, again, make sure we have the right flow coming through there. And you see here where we've got commissaires now in the other straights and even in the third corner, sorry, allows them to better cover those areas. And one of the areas that's very beneficial to have an official standing is in the finish area, so that if we see something that we're concerned about, we need to stop and talk to a rider. Obviously, that's hard to do when they're racing or practicing on the track. So having somebody at the finish line that can stop that rider safely, pass on instructions, provide a warning, give feedback back to the rest of the team. So when we have officials on the track, we need to have them in staging. We need to be able to do equipment check, change between groups, transition between the different practice groups. We need somebody up on the top of the start hill. That's a gate operator for one, but we also need somebody behind the gate, making sure the right riders are going into the gate, doing another check of their equipment, and making sure that the track is clear before that gate is dropped. As I said, on the track, we're looking for at least 3. Ideally, we have more. We also need to make sure we have a medical team, and that includes 2 medics. And why we say 2 is if a medic is dealing with 1 injury, we'd like to be able to continue practice if it's safe to do so, and that allows the other medic to supervise a practice. Now, of course, if we're dealing with more injuries than we have medics to cover, we'll need to stop practice until such time as that staff returns. So what does the flow of a practice look like? So when a group starts their practice, they'll quite often either come to the base of the start hill. In the case of a supercross track where we're using a large 8-meter hill, or in the case of smaller 5-meter and under hills, they may actually come to the back of the start hill itself and roll from the very top of the start hill. We tend to start with a warm-up, and this is without gate. So it allows the riders to ride around on the track, get some of the timing, get their legs warmed up. And that can last anywhere from 5 to 15 or maybe longer, depending on the group, where they're just trying to get used to the track surface itself. Once that warm-up is completed, we'll start using the gate and bring the gate up to launch groups of 8 riders onto the track. Normally the pace is pretty high. We'd be dropping another gate as soon as that first practice group has made it to the end of the second straight. Typically that's about as fast as you can do it, and as far as being able to get the gate up and reloaded and check to make sure it's safe to do so. It's important that we encourage riders to not stop on the track. We've all seen riders stop on the side and gather and talk and look at lines, but this can be dangerous. If too many riders are on the side, they can get in the way of the other riders. They can decide to go and not see that there's a rider coming and get into an interference. So as officials and as track staff, we need to make sure that we encourage people to move on. And importantly, we need to have riders that exit at the finish, go back through the staging system, and then come back to the start hill. We don't want riders coming from the second corner and pushing their bikes up to the top of the start hill. We don't want riders cutting back across the track. Again, this is dangerous when we have a high volume of riders coming through. So what are some of the responsibilities of a commissaire or a track official while they're out on the track during practice? So first of all, we're asking that they monitor their area. So whether they're on the first corner or in straights, they're looking for that area, making sure the riders are going through it safely, looking for any hazards that are there. But you also need to maintain awareness of the entire track. When's the next gate dropping? Has the last group made it through the finish line? Is there a challenge somewhere that needs to be dealt with? We need to look for and anticipate problems. If we can see something happening, a track degrading, dust gathering, we need to deal with it in advance. One of our critical roles is responding to crashes, protecting the rider first, making sure that they get the medical treatment they need, making sure the track is ready to go before we put more riders back onto it. We need to monitor rider behavior, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next section. But are they following instructions? Are they doing what is asked? Are they participating in a fair and sporting manner? And as we mentioned about practice for commissaires during practice, we need to look at where we're seeing repeated crashes. Do we feel the track is adequate in those areas? Do we have medical staff ready to go close to those spots? Do we maybe need to reposition a track official to be closer to those areas? Is there problems with the track? Is it getting dirty? Is it raining? And is it softening up? Is there any issues that is causing the track to become unsafe? And where are the people that are moving around? Where are the medics standing? Do they have good access to points that they're trying to get to? Where are the photographers trying to get to? And again, are they in safe places? Are they able to move between safe places? Do we have spectators or other staff coming through in the wrong areas? We need to make sure we know what is going on and whether we need to make adjustments before racing itself starts. And lastly, we should not leave practice unless we notify the president of the commissaires panel. Practice is important that we maintain the safety for those riders, and if somebody is missing, we can very easily miss a rider or miss an injury. So it's important that if you need to leave for whatever reason, that you notify the PCP before doing so, and then we can adjust. So crash management, how do we deal with that? So if a rider crashes, first thing we need to do is put up a yellow flag as a first notification. We need to announce on a radio that a crash has occurred and to hold the gate if necessary. We also need to move to protect the rider. So while you're doing all these many things, we need to assess where we can be to best get other riders to go around the rider that has fallen and make sure that they are not going to be hit by the next gate coming if it dropped before you could stop it, or other riders that are on the track. Only when it's safe to do so, when the track is safe, can you bring medics out onto the track and make sure that they can provide the support necessary to the downed rider. And of course, it's important that once the track is clear, the rider's been removed, we've assessed that there's no debris or other hazards left on the track, we let practice resume and we notify them. So how do we close out practice? So when we have a published practice schedule, say practice is to start at 9 and it's to finish at 9:45, that's the time that the riders are to be actually on the track. So one, it's important that we start staging before the practice session begins, so that at 9 o'clock, we have riders at the top of the hill and they're ready to go into practice. But more critically, it means that we stop staging at an appropriate time before the end of practice. So as I mentioned before, if we decided it takes, say, 10 minutes to get from the back end of staging through the crowd into the gate, that means we need to stop staging that practice group 10 minutes before the end of their practice, meaning we can then start staging the next group and have them start exactly on time. It's important that your staging team understands this. It's important that as an officials group, we are in communication with each other to make sure we're aware of those timing concerns and that we're able to make those changes. So we looked at preparing for practice, how we manage it, what our tasks are, how to handle crashes very briefly, and then of course, how to wrap up our practice in a timely manner. So the last topic that I wanted to cover before we close out today's session is around participant behavior, specifically in practice sessions outside of racing incidents. So we want to talk about the basic rules of conduct for riders at BMX events and touch briefly on the differences between warnings, relegations, and disqualifications. This is not meant to be an all-encompassing section. There would be, a larger expanded e-learning module for BMX and others, a greater discussion on this. But as to the influence that they have in practice, I wanted to touch on those briefly. So within the general regulations, the section 1 of the UCI rulebook, section 1.2.079 states that all license holders shall at all times be properly dressed and behave correctly in all circumstances, even when not racing. So as an example, when practicing. They shall refrain from any acts of violence, threats, or insults, or any other improper behavior, or from putting other persons in danger. They may not in word, gesture, writing, or otherwise harm the reputation or question the honor of other license holders, officials, sponsors, federations, the UCI, or cycling in general. The right of criticism shall be exercised in a motivated and reasonable manner and with moderation. This means we expect riders, even when not racing, to uphold the utmost of sportsmanship. If they have concerns or questions, we, of course, as officials, will hear and listen to those, but we are not to tolerate there to be harsh language or to be yelling or to be unreasonable in those requests of support. Further, in the BMX regulations, there are some additional words around this topic. 6.1.045 talks about that all riders must observe the UCI regulations and follow all instructions given to them by any commissaire or official at any time during the course of the event. And in a moment, we'll provide a little bit of clarity about what we mean by event. Every rider must at all times observe such conduct as reflects the ideals of good sportsmanship and avoid any conduct which may bring himself or the sport of BMX into disrepute. The use of obscene or foul language is forbidden. Riders using such language will be penalized in a manner to be determined by the commissaire panel. So again, we're building on this idea that at all times we expect riders to behave in an appropriate manner. And as such, there are rules within the regulations with which we can encourage that appropriate behavior. So if we talk about warnings, relegations, and disqualifications, again, this is just a brief discussion on what those are and how they're different. But typically as officials, we have the option of no penalty or no call. We could choose to do nothing. This is typically when an external element, wind, obstacles, external features impact the race. We can issue warnings. Typically, this is done due to repeated demonstrated poor behavior. We can deal with relegation. Those are often used obviously during a racing instance where an action that occurred, whether intentional or not, changed the result. And then lastly, we have the power of disqualification. This is when there was a deliberate action that was unsporting or against regulations, and we need to disqualify them. So for our last poll that I'd like to bring up, we want to talk about what is the definition of an event, and that has to deal with how we use warnings. So when we talk about the days that are considered to be part of an event, do we talk about race days only? So when the rules say an event, we're talking about racing? Do we talk about practice and all race days? Or do we talk about practice with a single race day in the case where we're dealing with multiple race weekends, where we have a race on a Saturday, for example, and then a completely different race or a second race on a Sunday? Great, Andreas, thanks for sharing that. And the answer that you guys have provided are accurate, and it's important that you interpret what an event is. So when we're talking about a single event, so whether it's a large race that actually requires multiple days to do the racing itself, absolutely, an event covers practice and all the days of racing. However, if we're dealing with a weekend where maybe we have multiple races, like I said, where you have a particular race completed in its entirety on Saturday, and another race, a brand new race done on a Sunday with a practice on a Friday night, we actually split those into two events where we say the practice on Friday and racing on Saturday is one event, and a practice on a Friday and racing on a Sunday is a second event. The reason that's important is that in the rulebook in 6.1.064, we talk about the application of warnings. So firstly, if a rider is given a verbal warning, they're asked to do something, there is no real consequence to that. If we have to ask repeatedly for behavior to be corrected, we would write an official warning that goes onto a notice board or onto the results. And again, there isn't any real consequence to the rider for that other than the notification of the warning. But 6.1.064 talks about if a second warning in the same event is issued to the same rider for any incident, that rider can be disqualified. So when we talk about what is an event, we need to make sure we're aware of the practice days, and we're make sure that we know of the race day itself. So if a rider did something that was troubling or bothersome on a Friday night and was issued a formal warning, not just a verbal warning, but a formal written warning, any further punishment on a Saturday or Sunday could have them disqualified from that event. So they could be disqualified from Saturday's event, but still allowed to race in Sunday's event, or you might find that they have to be disqualified from both. So like I said, this discussion on warnings, relegations, and disqualifications is not meant to be all-encompassing. In additional training that we will have in the future, we will dig into these topics in much greater detail. So with that, I'd like to close out the talking point for me, and I'm hoping that there were some questions that we might be able to answer, and I'll turn it to Andreas to field those for me.
Yes, thank you, Jordi. It's been really interesting session. We have few questions only, to be honest. So maybe people, they were quite focused on what you were speaking. Maybe there are some questions still will come in the meantime. So the first one is coming from David. Did you not set any judge at the finish line in case of technical measures did not work, meaning photo finish or timing?
Right, so the positions that I identified in this slide was around practice itself. So of course, we're not timing or doing results. If we were to discuss positions for officials for racing, that would be a little bit different than what we do for practice.
Okay, great. So the second question is coming from Harun. If we shorten the practice, can we make it less than 4 laps?
It's when we're dealing with weather, crashes, other interferences, sometimes we have to understand the greater impact of that. Quite often when we have a practice schedule that's laid out, there's plenty of time. There's often more than enough time for 4 laps. But if, for example, weather rolls in and forces you to delay practice or cancel practice, you have to make those assessments as to whether enough time was given. The idea is if the riders didn't have enough time to do those 4 laps, it could be very dangerous to put them into racing. So it might force you to not only change your practice schedule, but adjust your race schedule if it means inserting some additional practice to get a few extra laps in.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Maninder. Can you please share specification for bib and bike number bibs? So
yeah, so the specifications for that is within the UCI regulations, and like I said, this one module is a piece of many, and we would discuss that in other places, but we can definitely share via email the exact regulation where that is. Technically, where that is found is in actually the very back of the general regulations, the first section of the UCI rulebook.
Okay, great. So another question is coming from Thomas. A second offense means disqualification or third? Or Graf was third?
Yeah, sorry. Second is disqualification. So let me just go back to that image really quick. So what I was trying to make the point of is that a warning can be issued. The first time a warning is issued formally and it's in writing has very little impact. If a second warning for any instance occurs, not only is that warning awarded, but the rider is disqualified.
Okay, another question from Mohammed. Practice strictly can into age groups, or is it still okay to practice as mixed group, but riders must be responsible?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways those groups come together. You know, you've got different sizing of events. You know, if you've got a smaller event, you don't need as many different groups because, you know, you don't need 3 people practicing by themselves. But it's important to look at what that makeup is and make sure that we divide them appropriately by age and ability. So maybe you're dealing with the higher ability classes riding together, but you, for example, don't want to have a 5-year-old riding with an 18-year-old on a track at the same time because they just ride so very differently in speed. It can be very dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Enrique is asking, everyone inside the track permitted fans must have an UCI license or just an authorization?
I think the answer is probably an authorization. I mean, when we talk about UCI licenses, they are in certain areas, and one of this part of the e-learnings that you'll go through is some of the general regulations and talk discussion about licenses. So, you know, managers, mechanics, riders, of course, officials have licenses. But in many cases, people that are involved on the track are volunteers, people that work at the track that are there to help sweep corners. Medical staff, like, you know, the paramedics that are on site aren't necessarily licensed, but they need to have an approval to be there. So sometimes that's best to be managed through some sort of identification or ID so that you, as an official, know that they're allowed to be there. Or more importantly, that you've just had a conversation with them in advance of them going out of the track so that they're aware.
Okay, thanks. Inge is asking, will the warning be lapsed by end of the practice day or carry on the race day?
Yeah, so like I said, this is where we talk about warnings applying to an entire event. So if you've got many races that, you know, that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure is similar in other countries, you'll have a practice day or you'll have practice in advance of the actual race day. So if you had an event where, say, you did some practicing on a Friday and then racing was on Saturday, that is, both of those days account to be an event. So if a rider was given a warning on Friday, they kind of have only one more shot. If they were to, you know, ride with the wrong equipment after being informed to fix it, if they were, you know, came onto the track without the right equipment on, if they were to say something or behave in an inappropriate way and receive a second warning a day later in the same event, they'd be disqualified. And that was put in place to try to prevent riders from being feeling that they could just kind of be that constant annoyance or try to exert themselves, and make sure that we could have control over their behavior and make sure that they're working in a sporting manner.
Okay, thanks, Jordi. So Danuta is asking, could you please provide us the most common irregularities you penalized with the regulation, please?
So when we talk about penalties, and I know for BMX commissaires, this is a topic that we would go into great length. And in fact, you know, like I said, this is one module of what we'd expect to be many for a training cycle. We would need to go into that in greater depth than I can answer here. Relegation is used in racing scenarios where the result was affected. So a rider did something like, say, they cut a white line, they came in the inside of a corner, they left the track and came back, they interfered with another rider. Those are instances where you would say that the outcome of the race was changed, and as such, that rider needs to be relegated, as in scored last in that moto. It's not something I can go into great detail here because it would be, in that discussion, a 40-minute webinar on itself.
Yeah. Okay, another question from Peter. If the rider during the practice complete just one lap without gate, can this count for points?
I'm not sure what I mean for counting for points, but when we talk about providing time, you know, the schedule has to be such that there's time in the day for them to get those 4 laps in. And sometimes practices are set up where, you know, we'll have a group practice and then we'll go through other groups and we'll start over again. So we'll get 30 minutes at 9 o'clock and that same group gets another 30 minutes at noon. However we've done it, through the amount of practice time provided, they need to be able to complete 4 laps. Now the rider doesn't have to. Like I said, if it's their home track, they figure they've got it dialed, it's hot, they want to rest, then we would, you know, that's not on us to make happen. But if the time was available to them, then we've done what we could to make sure they could race safely.
Okay, thanks. Question from Gurul. Riders are carrying number plates during the practice. What does the riders carrying number plates?
Yeah, so that's what we talked about. It's important that confirmation or registration occurs before practice starts. The riders need to have those plates or the identification marks that say they've gone through registration so that we as officials know that their license has been checked, that they've paid the registration fees, that there are no impairments from them racing. So before they're allowed onto the practice track, those things have to happen. I know personally in our regional races here in Canada, it's very easy for the kid to jump out of the car, grab their bike, run to the start hill and want to get right at it. But it's important that we've gone through those registration steps and we know that everything's clear before they start practicing.
Okay, well, great. Thanks a lot, Jordi. So there is another question from Danuta. Transponders, can we expect some technical regulations?
Good question, Danuta. I think that would again be included in some of the other racing modules. When we, like I said, I laid out these 3 webinars, we picked 3 of what would be, I think, 16 different topics that we wanted to talk about as far as national commissaire training. And we look forward to being able to build out that training in the coming years to be able to provide something similar to what we're seeing on the road.
Okay, wow, great. So yeah, apparently we received some questions in the end. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating. By the end of this session, we have 136 people attending this.
It's fantastic.
Very first session, yeah, which is fantastic. So Jordi, thank you very much as well for doing all this great job to put this presentation together. And I think everybody's looking for tomorrow's session.
Yeah, I look forward to talking with you guys again tomorrow at the same time. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about managing an event and then talking about the timing of a race event itself.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Stay safe.